As a family, we were lucky enough to get a PlayStation at launch back in the 90s. Warhawk, Tekken, Street Fighter, the movie, the game based on the movie from the game, NBA Jam. Oh, and Ridge Racer. One track. It looked great, but one track, I mean, come on, really? Namco's name was all over the majority of these games. Sony's first foray into the console world after they were properly fucked by Nintendo. We had a handful of these titles in the big long boxes when they dropped, and I played the hell out of the PlayStation demo disc. A Japanese couple owned a rental shop in our area, and they would frequently bring in exclusives from overseas. It was here that I first played the original version of Mario 2 on a mysterious black cart. This was extremely tough to get a hold of because it rarely stayed on the shelf for very long. Everyone wanted to get their hands on the thing, and they had it before the official North American version dropped over here, so it was magical. Oh, and Mario 2 isn't actually Mario 2. It's customary to always remind people on the internet that it, in fact, started out as Doki Doki Panic. Where would we be without YouTube videos constantly reiterating this? Anyway, my long and winding point is, this small mom and pop shop decided to bring Kingsfield over near the launch of the PlayStation, From Software's first game ever that dropped 13 days after the release of the system exclusively in Japan. It looked so appealing to me, but sadly I couldn't play it on my North American kit, so it might have been better just to flush my $2 down the toilet. What a bummer. And yes, $2. That's what they used to charge. If I remember correctly, they doubled the price of these rental games when disc-based media came out, but I'm getting off topic again, and people have been very vocal about how much they can't stand my intro tangents, so I'll just shut the fuck up. The first game I played in this series was the second one, retitled simply to Kingsfield Over Here. It was actually the second entry over in Japan, actually, and began as actually Doki Doki Panic 3D. The second, or first, Kingsfield hooked me right away as a fan of games like Fatal Labyrinth and Dragon Crystal, which I've already covered on this channel. It's oppressive, dark, and occasionally clunky, but one of my favorites on the original PlayStation. When emulation for Sony's 32-bit console became a thing, it was the first Kingsfield that lured me in. I downloaded it without an English patch and sank so much time into it. Similarly to those Sega roguelike RPGs, I found these FromSoft games extremely addictive. Kingsfield doesn't rely on randomly generated dungeons, but the feeling was there. Dark, spooky mazes loaded to the tits with interesting enemies. To say I love these games would be a massive understatement, and I'm so glad to finally be able to talk about them on this channel. Eventually, an English patch was created, so that's the version we'll be looking at in this video. Emulated, of course, in case you were wondering, because I'm a filthy, filthy boy. Kingsfield opens with some intense music and a super quick text scroll. You take control of Jean-Alfred Forrester, a man searching for his father who has disappeared within the depths of the catacombs of Verdite. Throughout your journey, you will occasionally happen upon travelers and other mysterious NPCs as you work your way down the 5 explorable floors beneath the monastery. Visually, this is a pretty ugly game, even for its time, but personally, I find the dark atmosphere and muddy textures appealing. There's an oppressive nature to the environments that works, at least for me. It's easy to get lost within these labyrinthine underground corridors, but there are enough items and enemies to keep eager explorers entertained. The soundtrack, composed by Koji Endo and Kaoru Kono, complements the environments perfectly with enough organ-based themes to make Iron Butterfly green with envy. This is a truly remarkable score that deserves a lot more credit. The first few floors have some of the best pieces of music on the PlayStation. Similarly to From Software's 2009 masterpiece, Demon Souls, the tunes change after a certain point in the game, and while I do think the last area's theme is a bit too chaotic and quick to loop, the rest of the score is perfect, so it's an easy thing to forgive. Control-wise, this is a very early PlayStation game before the days of the dual analog sticks, so it will likely take most players a few moments to adjust themselves. Moving around is done with the D-pad, and 2 of the shoulder buttons tilt the camera, while the other pair allows your character to strafe. The latter is pretty important to get the hang of in order to avoid incoming melee and projectile attacks. Jean-Alfred moves around with the swiftness of a snail in a tar patch, so anticipating enemy attacks is crucial. Similarly to From Software's modern Souls entries, getting behind a baddie is an optimal strategy, but they often turn at the same speed as you do, so it's not always easy. Strafing back and forth as magic gets tossed your way never gets old. The combat is limited, sure, but it's balanced. This isn't going to be the type of game for everyone, but patience and perseverance will always offer positive results. Your character levels up gradually as you progress, and it always feels good getting better, offensively as well as defensively. I'm not much of an RPG guy, so an adventure like this, where I'm not spending half of my time in the menus, is refreshing. Weapons and armor can be purchased or found. Fans of the Souls games might find it interesting to know that this was the first title to include the Moonlight Sword, a staple across quite a few From Software titles. It doesn't take an enormous amount of imagination to notice common themes across this company's medieval adventures. As you wander through the 5 floors of Kingsfield, you'll come up against a variety of different creatures. Golems that would look right at home in Dark Souls 2's muddy world of Drangleic, dragon-helmeted demons, knights, Lizalfos warriors, and giggle ghosts. Oh my.
Oh my.
Armed skeletons, Audrey Flora, nightmare demons, quartered watermelons with 70s disco party vortex mouths. Oh yeah.
Oh my.
Kingsfield isn't a horror game per se, but things can get unnerving at times, mostly due to the desolate environments and limited draw distances. Things will just pop into existence as you make your way through the many mazes. I think a lot of these elements make for a fun, spooky time, and the restrictions of the PlayStation 1's hardware adds to the overall ambiance. When this thing dropped, there wasn't anything like it on consoles, and as a first release by From Software, I think it still holds up. You kinda have to be into this sort of thing though. It's easy to understand how some modern audiences might find the visuals crude or the mechanics too archaic, but as a fan of, like I said, games like Fatal Labyrinth and its kin, I fell in love with this series from the get-go. Saving can be done at any time by way of wall-mounted crucifixes. Merlin from the Looney Tunes lends a hand as a merchant, but he never relocates himself, meaning if you want to buy or sell items, you'll need to return to the first floor. A fountain can also be revived on this level, but it's also the only place in the world where you can top up both your health and magic. The game isn't too long and there are easy to access portals throughout, but it would have been nice to have a few more places to stock up. There's a rod that can teleport the player to the previous entrance, but you will still need to make it back to the first floor. Fortunately, the developers tossed in some generous warps later on in the game, but it would have been nice if there were more vendors throughout, if you know what I mean. Several magic spells are taught to you. Some remove status effects, such as poison, or reduce damage from specific attacks, but there's also an ability that allows the player to heal, as well as a few offensive projectiles. An MP meter accompanies the health at the top of the screen with a Souls-like stamina bar for each. One face button acts as the melee input, while another casts magic. It's important to learn how to volley between the two in order to inflict the maximum amount of damage. The game doesn't get too challenging until the final floor, so you'll have plenty of time to get good by the time you get truly bombarded by foes, and boy, does this last area not fool around. I didn't die once while capturing footage until I got here. It's a relatively small space to make your way through, but it's littered with one-way passages and confusing portals that warp you to new locations. Couple that with the short, frantic music, vibrant red visuals, and dastardly beefed up baddies, and you've got yourself a hellish little hate prison to work your way through. It's a suitable final stretch with a short side quest to complete. Each floor could be considered a puzzle box. Meandering about is entertaining from beginning to end because the objective on each level is different. Purchasing a cross and retrieving a goblet is the initial goal. Acquiring a harp to summon a bridge is what needs to be done in the second area, and so on. Yes, the combat is basic, and sure, the visuals look dated, but the clever way it switches things up never got old for me. I really like how it's possible to completely overlook an item or an NPC and how these things affect how your journey plays out. Believe it or not, I finished Kingsfield for the first time not knowing there was a map. Overlooking how to reactivate the fountain is a situation that is totally feasible as well. Keys are mandatory to progress, while other pickups simply make the world a lot easier to deal with. Nasty traps will be the death of most players. The enemies feel more like distractions. It might take a while to learn each floor's layout as there are so many hidden pathways to discover, but most are located in logical areas. Some are even hinted at with window-sized gaps in the walls, so astute players shouldn't get too screwed. The map helps throughout the first couple of areas, but as you dive deeper, less is directly shown. An X marks the location of your hero all of the time, but it can be tricky to find your way when you're wandering around a seemingly empty portion of the paper. The compass helps a lot, and it's this that I would refer to more often than not, especially in the more confusing regions where it feels like the developer's intent was to spin the player around. There are several melee weapons strewn throughout the 5 stages, as well as a few types of armor that can be equipped to Jean's body in fragments. Almost all of these bits can be purchased from NPCs, but I've always preferred spending my gold on various replenishing weed strands and potions. The drops aren't random, and the game doles goodies out in a fair way. There were times where I'd feel like my current weapon wasn't doing enough damage, or that my gear felt under-leveled, but then boom, I discover a new weapon or find some snazzy new duds. The pace is on point, and pickups are everywhere. You'll likely need to spend $1 or $2 on potions and herbs, but Kingsfield rarely, if ever, leaves you caught with your pants down. Duplicate gear will earn you a decent amount of scratch when sold, and there are jewels lying around that are meant to be gotten rid of. The sole purpose of these things is to hawk them for a decent reward. Weird, but I'm not complaining, as one of the first objectives in this adventure is to purchase an item that costs a ton of moolah. Some weapons and gear have passive perks, such as super slow health and MP restoration, which is a nifty little addition. Item descriptions are easy to read in the menus, and I'd advise using this feature as some things have interesting, let's just say, surprises to discover. The stamina meter depletes differently depending on the weapon, and that's a lot of damned Ds. Swinging an axe won't be the same as, say, using the triple fang for instance, but that's some pretty obvious stuff. It would have been nice if there was some more variety when it came to melee options, but again, it's not too long of a game, so what's here is fine. Equipment, accessories, there's enough to fiddle around with, and plenty of secrets to discover. There's only one boss, 2 if you count a skirmish at the end of the 4th floor, but it becomes a regular enemy in the final area, so I'm not sure if that one makes the cut. There's not a lot of feedback when it comes to combat. You'll need to find a baddie's sweet spot as you duck and weave when up close, but most of them do make a sound when struck. The exception are the Charlie Brown ghosts, who are barely visible, but even they make a creepy little giggle when they're close. A good decision made by the developers, as they often blend in with the backgrounds. All in all, the majority of the baddies are pretty passive until the final stretch. They don't chase you down or seem to want to have anything to do with you until provoked. It's kinda easy to just walk right by them for the first half of the game or so. 99% of the time they are placed in reasonable spots, but there is one section where you get dumped into a new stage right under the noses of 2 Dranglaic dummies. By this point in the game, you should be able to tank their blows like a pro, but it's still a dick move. Like, they're right on fucking top of you. Each floor has its own unique color scheme and tile pattern. Safe zones are typically represented with wooden textures, and most of the stages look fine with the exception of some of the areas in level 4. It's nauseating to my senses, like an unsolicited viewing of an obese man's colonoscopy cam after consuming nothing but quarter pounders, cheap beers, and Carolina Reaper peppers. You're welcome. Kingsfield is a special game for me. The fact that I had my hands on the disc when the PlayStation first dropped but I couldn't play it always made this a bit of a curiosity. So especially special thanks has to go out to the community for translating it. It's completely possible to get through without the English patch, but oh so much better to be able to read stuff on the screen. It's clear that From Software were inspired by this when designing Demon's Souls. The dark fantasy world, cryptic storytelling, and interconnected passageways began here. I like how each floor feels like its own mini dungeon, and how late game shortcuts reveal new paths to previous areas. Kingsfield is another one of those games that I just love to play when I've gotten a little bit too high. It's fucking fantastic. Next time on this channel, more Kingsfield, so stay tuned. Duh.